Hi, everyone.
Yeah. Hello.
Well,
A good start. Yeah, we'll give it another like minute or so, and then we'll kind of kick it off just in case there's anyone last minute.
I don't know, Rick. All the best conversations I've ever been in have started with awkward silence, just staring at a blank screen. So I
Right?
think we're off to a perfect start here. Well, just for everyone that's joining, we'll kind of get started here in a couple minutes. We'll just let people log in. We're going to be using the Q&A function, so there'll be lots of time at the end for some questions. Rick's going to do a bit more of an intro here in a second, but we want to make sure this is an open conversation. So we've got some questions. We're going to talk to each other, and then we'll obviously go through the Q&A at the end from you.
Very nice. Hi to Belinda and Jacqueline and Marcia in the chat. Marcia from Brooklyn. That's a familiar name. You're on our AAOA webinars quite often. It's good to see some familiar names here in the chat. And Dave as well from South Asheville, North Carolina. Welcome. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys all taking the time to come out and listen to us. So no pressure, Grant.
I'm good.
I'm kidding. Like I've got this. Okay. Why don't we you guys ready?
We are.
Ready.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'll go and kick this off. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're going to be talking about is rent reporting going to become nationwide? So in California, they passed Assembly Bill 2747, making it requirement for those 16 units and above. But we're going to talk about how's this going to affect everybody, right? Because it always starts somewhere. My name is Rick Albert. I'm a Los Angeles-based broker associate. I'm also the host of the podcast, The Key to the City of Angels, and I work a lot with investors. I'm an investor myself. We also have today Miss Alexandra Alvarado. Yes, from the American Apartment Owners Association. There you go. I've been practicing, so I apologize. So thank you for coming. We also have Grant Burwash of FrontLobby, who works with all the credit reporting. So thank you both for being here. It's kind of a big deal, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah. So why don't we start off with Grant? Kind of give us an overview of this assembly bill.
Sure. I'll maybe take a step back first. So we're going to be talking about rent reporting and credit bureaus a lot. So let's just kind of lay some foundation. So what we're going to be talking through is rent reporting is the ability for a housing provider to report rental payments to the credit bureaus. You can report both on-time payments, which helps improve the credit, boost the score, or you can report negative payments, which of course has a negative impact. And when we talk about reporting both positive, negative, you may hear terms like full file or negative reporting, those sorts of things. So this historically hasn't been a part of the housing industry. This is relatively new for renters for having the ability, and a lot of that is because in Canada, about 75% of housing is provided by smaller independents. In the US, it's just under 50%. And so you have a lot of data that has to come from smaller independents. And until companies like FrontLobby came around, there was no real way to get rental data at scale. That's changed in recent years, which is why you're starting to see bills like this come about. The intent with this bill is to increase the prevalence of on-time rent reporting, which means that you're using those rental payments, often the largest expense every single month, to boost a credit file. This is visible to all future creditors. And to give you an example, in 2022, we actually released a multi-year study with Equifax where we saw that 48% of participants only had a credit file because of the rental data. And we saw credit scores jump somewhere between 30 to 100 points within 6 months, obviously depending on where they started. If they're at 350, it's going to jump closer to 100. And if you're in the 600s, it's going to be a lot lower. And so the positive impact that that can have on someone's financial well-being is pretty great. And everyone on this call, being a housing provider or interested in the housing space, will understand what that does as far as providing access to credit, lower interest rates, lower mortgages, credit cards, et cetera. So that's a bit of a backstory around why this is kind of becoming a part of the conversation. AB 2747 is California specific legislation. It only applies to housing providers that have buildings with 15 plus units, or they own multiple buildings where they are a corporation, a REIT, or an LLC where one of the owners is a corporation. So it's geared towards that larger tier of housing provider, not you if you're just renting out your basement. What it does is it mandates that those individuals must provide the ability for their tenants to opt in or opt out of having their positive rental payments reported. There's specific notice requirements, meaning that any lease after April 1st, you must provide this option to your new tenants. And once a year, you must provide the opportunity to your tenants to opt into this program as well. The tenants can pay for it. You don't have to do the burden, but various technology providers like FrontLobby have developed solutions which help you comply with these sorts of things. So in a gist, that's what the law is about. It's about mandating specific housing providers in California that operate larger buildings that they have to offer tenants the ability to report on-time payments, and that these tenants can choose to participate. Now, before we kind of go on the discussion, like one of the big misunderstandings we've had is this only actually applies to positive payments. So it doesn't override your ability as a housing provider or a creditor to report a debt. So this is only focused on positive reporting, and it doesn't impact your ability to report debts under the FCRA. So I'm sure there'll be other questions that will come up about that, but that's a bit of a quick overview. Alexandra, with AAOA, you have members that are all over the US. I mean, I know a large number are from California, but after this has come out on April 1st, what kind of questions are you seeing through your organization, and how are your members actually reacting to this?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So I'm with the American Apartment Owners Association. I know many of you on the call today that I invited are from AAOA as well. And we do work with property managers and landlords nationwide. And I hear a lot of what they have to say. And I think there's always a bit of concern when there's a new law, mostly because that means that there could be liability, right, with following said law, and also the process in which it takes to implement the law and how that might change their current process, especially for property management companies. I think it really does make them a bit nervous, right? They are managing maybe many properties in their portfolio that might be in California. And so there's definitely been some concern. And I think the other part of it has been, well, how much work is this going to take for us to do? And how much is it going to cost us? And can we get sued? Those are typically things that I've been hearing around. And I think one of the other things that you mentioned, Grant, is that a lot of people seem to think that you can no longer report debt. And that's not the case. As you showed me, the actual law says absolutely nothing about debt or negative rent reporting. It really only addresses positive. So that's good news. It really does mean that you can still report debts, which is great. So it didn't take away your ability to do that. And I think there's a misconception among even our members that it did. And so we're trying to clear up that rumor and try to inform our members that it can actually be a good thing for landlords too, not just for tenants, even though I know normally California laws tend to be very tenant friendly. In this case, I think it can benefit landlords as well.
And are you finding that they're able to kind of access the answers that they have, or is there still uncertainty when they kind of read through the law or speak with you or lawyers or those sorts of things around it?
Yeah, there's still uncertainty. So I think they feel mostly that there might be liability if they are to report something inaccurately, right? So whatever system they're using to do the rent reporting, does that system have some safety measures in place that will reduce their liability? And I know FrontLobby does. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we partnered with FrontLobby is because it makes it very difficult for you to accidentally report someone as not paying rent. It defaults to them paying rent. And so that is really a way that it can prevent that fear from actually happening. And then I would say the other part of it is now, are we required to put it in the the lease agreement? And can you report it if it's not in the lease agreement? Like, what does the opt-in process look like for the tenants on their side? And how is the landlord going to manage that in an easy way? So I think there's some questions still around that part of it and how it is going to be when they sign up, let's say with FrontLobby. And then secondly, when they have the debt that they want to report, how is that different, right? How do they actually report debt in a way that is going to affect maybe on their collection side of the report? Is that even a possibility now with the law? And as we mentioned, it is. And I think one of the things that is great about FrontLobby is that it does offer both the rent reporting and the debt reporting. And so I think that's really something that's helpful, and also that it's not as easy to make a mistake or accidentally report the wrong information to the credit bureaus.
Right.
I have a quick question. Has the property managers talked about their best practices, because if they might have one client that has 20 units and then they have another client that has 1 unit. But for them, I could imagine trying to manage all of that. Like, oh yeah, this applies to this client, but doesn't apply to that client. Has there been any conversation behind that?
Yes, definitely. And I think one of the things too that we've seen is really working. I keep bringing up FrontLobby. I know it's not the FrontLobby show here, but working with a rent reporting company like FrontLobby that can kind of help you to set up that kind of system in place. So
Hmm.
I would say, even if it's not required for a landlord to do it, this is something that they should probably consider doing anyway, because there are so many benefits to doing it. And the tenant can pay the bill for it. So, I mean, if they're opting in, I mean, it's not like you're just giving them something that you're paying for to help them out. You're also getting the benefit of getting on-time rent payments, because there's an incentive now, especially if the tenant is paying for the service, right? So the California law allows you to go up to $10, or the cost of the rent reporting itself. So at that price, I mean, if the tenant really wants to grow their credit and they want to pay on time, that's amazing. I mean, that's really, I think, something that property managers should try to sell their smaller landlords on, because it does benefit them as well. In fact, it could even be a sales point for the property management company to say that implementing this on behalf of the landlord does actually help with on-time payments.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've seen similar that in the conversation I've had, if a property manager adopts a technology, it tends to be applied to their entire portfolio. So it's
Right.
just often easier to provide the same services as Alexandra said. It often becomes a selling point that, hey, we're using this platform, or we provide, the ability to report credit, or we provide, these insurance options, whatever that is. And just to make it easier for those housing providers, especially if they're on this smaller side. Individuals that own 10 properties or one property that are using a property manager are often going to them as just to offload the burden of managing that property. Maybe they don't even live in the state, or they just don't want to handle it. And so most of the conversations I've had have stemmed around, it's like, okay, great. The California legislation has brought this to the forefront of the conversation, but now how can it actually impact the rest of my properties, even if they're in a different state?
And Rick, too, I wanted to ask you as well, from your side, what impact are you seeing of AB 2747 with your owner operators that you're working with?
Yeah, so for the last like week or so, I've been making a lot of phone calls and doing surveys. I also manage a Facebook group at almost 1,500 members, mostly primarily in Southern California. The general consensus is if they don't have to do it, they don't want to do it, right? So if they have less than, the 15 or less, just because for a lot of them, they're self-managing. So in their minds, like, okay, this is just one more thing I have to do. That's been like the general consensus. I did do a survey, and overwhelmingly, the majority did say they would be open to offering this as long as they didn't have to pay for it. That was kind of like the big thing. And then, if someone owns 16 or more units, typically that's when it goes on the property management side, or they hopefully will have systems in place to where if they needed to implement this, it wouldn't be as big a deal. Right. So for California, they do have the new California Association of Realtors form for this. So the form's already made for you. So the tenant can just say, yep, I agree to it. Then they can hop onto the service. So it's not as big a deal, but that's been like the general consensus is like, if I don't have to do it, I won't do it, but some would be open to it.
And has most of that focused on just the positive side, Rick? Or are you finding that people are interested in or have any idea that you can also report debts? Like, as you've had those conversations, where's that trended towards?
Yeah, so I mean, most of the conversations have been about positive. I would always highlight, like, keep in mind, this also can make it easier to report negative payments. For some mom and pops, they're like, or some they didn't know they could. I will say that was always a common question before this is like, how do I report non-payment? Because at least in LA, as I'm sure it is in San Francisco, probably New York, it's if a tenant stops paying, now becomes negotiations. But in the meantime, if you can say, look, you technically haven't paid, it technically has to ding, it could apply pressure to them to basically negotiate. Don't know that's what I'm like envisioning. And that's been some of the conversations I've had. So
Yeah.
to your point, like, yeah, in that respect. Typically, a lot of these mom pops, if they're not paying, that's a whole nother story. Others are typically dealing with people being like a week late, 2 weeks late, in which case they wouldn't report anyways.
Yeah. I think one of my biggest frustrations with this legislation is it's very prescriptive on
Hmm.
specific aspects, like around what the notice has to have, that it, you know, they can mail it in or you must provide it at the time of a lease signing, but yet it's oddly ambiguous in other components. And, specifically, it's meant to encourage on-time reporting, as we initially highlighted, around the positive side. And yet it doesn't mention anything around debts, or it doesn't mention some of these other things that rent reporting can do to benefit a housing provider. And, that ambiguity or uncertainty, as we've all mentioned, I think has been one of the biggest challenges with this rollout, is that one, people don't understand if it applies to you. Even if you own more than 15 units, if they're not in a single building and you're not a corporation, an LLC, or a member of a corporation or a REIT, which most people on the call probably won't be, then it doesn't apply to you. And most people then shut off at that point in time. Whereas, like, the benefit of this legislation is you have conversations like this, that this does exist within the housing space. And this is something you can use to protect yourself and benefit your tenants. And, by the way, the more financial data that we get on the credit files, the better it will be for the industry, and not just the rental industry, but the entire credit industry, because it creates that accountability and transparency that is desperately needed around housing payments.
I do agree, because one of the things I really don't like is it did, like, I'm looking at the form now. It says offer of tenant positive rental payment reporting. And it's like it should be clear that it does work both ways. So like even though the law says you can report negative debt, but like I could totally foresee a tenant saying, well, I only signed up for positive. I didn't know that, it was negative as well. So it's like, okay, is this where leases need to start being clear? Like, hey, look, if you opt into this, just like as an FYI, it can work both ways.
Yeah. I mean, we created clauses earlier on as a company that you should add
Sure.
to your leases. This is way before legislation like this, because one of the biggest benefits of reporting is you have that conversation with an applicant. And I know we'll probably talk more about screening later, but it's a matter of saying, hey, Rick, just so you know, I report rental data, which means that if you rent from me, you can use this to build your credit. It's a huge benefit from you. And by the way, if you don't pay, that also gets reported. And everyone today that signs up for a mortgage, you understand that that data is going to the credit bureau. When you get
Yeah.
your credit card in the mail, you understand that those payments are going to the credit bureaus. But because this has not been just part of our social core recently, as far as rental payments going to the credit bureaus, there is so much uncertainty, or tenants that just try and poke at things. And we deal with this every single day around, hey, you can't report this, or I disagree with that. It's like, well, it's a standard dispute process and things. Like, you don't have to consent. The debt can exist as long as it's accurate and up to date, and abides by the local legislation. So yeah, it definitely has caused some great challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. Because in California, tenants will try to, some tenants, there's some great tenants out there. I've had some great tenants, but there are tenants out there that will try to, oh, I didn't like this, or oh, I'm in negotiations with my housing provider. So can you please not dock it? But it's like, well, then it's up to the housing provider at that point, I would think, right? Because to my understanding, is you have to actively say, hey, they missed a payment.
Yeah, usually the data that gets reported is, I mean, the housing provider ultimately owns that data. They are
Right.
the creditor. So, that, and reporting of rental data always occurs for the previous month. So in April, the March data gets reported. And so you have time to make sure that's accurate and up to date. And, if a tenant's on a payment plan, you can choose to report according to that payment plan, meaning that if they're up to date on that, they can actually use it to help build credit. So you have some autonomy over how that's reported, as long as it's accurate and reflecting to creditors, future creditors, what that individual is like from a risk standpoint. Like, the way I always like to think about it or explain it to individuals is, you know, if I am the next landlord looking at this data on a credit file, what would you have wanted that previous person to report? Right. And
Right.
you want that information to be as accurate as possible.
Got it. So then do you think this makes it like easier or safer for housing providers with this new legislation?
Yeah. I mean, I'm obviously an advocate of having rental data on credit files.
Right.
Built a company around it. So let's just say my bias exists there. What I Will I think it make it safer? Yes. as long as you get full data. So I don't think that skewing data towards positive only payments, that's the only thing exists. To me, that kind of erodes the authenticity or the purity of a credit file because it can be artificially boosted and doesn't actually reflect the risk of that person to a future creditor. What I do think it does was it brings these conversations to light, lets people know that this is an option. It'll create a lot of financial well-being for a lot of great tenants, which most of them are, and it will allow those housing providers that are willing to kind of engage in the conversation to understand, oh, actually, I can report all the information, positive, negative. And so I think it'll drive that. You asked the question, do I think it's easier though? That is no. I mean, I think legislation inherently puts more barriers into providing housing, especially for the smaller ones. Alexandra mentioned this. There's concern around, is this legal? What can I do? Like the more uncertainty, hurdles, roadblocks you put in place for the smaller independent housing provider, the harder it is for them to continue to provide housing. And it means they're going to reduce the rental stock that they provide. And that has to be either evaporated or taken up by larger corporations that have the legal teams, the technology resources to provide, single family rentals at scale, built for rent at scale. And I do think that in states like California or, New York, where you're seeing layers and layers and layers of legislation that start to come out that are mostly geared towards tenancy. And I don't mean that to be biased. They're usually meant to be provide, improve the housing stock. But, the more tenant positive legislation you put out, the more barriers you put in place for a landlord, the less independence you're going to have, which means the entire rental industry will continue to change.
And a lot of them are what we call accidental housing providers, right?
Yeah.
They moved out of their house. It made sense to keep it as a rental. Or what I've noticed in the group I manage, I was getting a lot of people who inherited properties and they inherited tenants. Like we didn't want to be a housing provider, but we inherited this building and now I have to manage it.
Yeah. Alexandra, what are your members saying? Are they finding that, do you agree with my hypothesis around it, that it kind of makes it harder? Like, contradict me if you think.
Absolutely. Jason said in the chat, especially in LA. I live in LA, so I definitely see that aspect of it as well. It's certainly every layer of law adds a bit of challenge with staying up to date. I mean, in California alone, Governor Newsom signed 60 housing laws in 2024 that go into effect this year. Fortunately, not all of them affect the rental housing industry, but a lot of them do. And so we're looking at a lot of landlords right now in California specifically scrambling to keep up with all of those new laws. And this is one of them. So yes, it does. And cumulatively, it does even more so make it challenging. I thought it was interesting too, what you mentioned, Grant, about just rental data on the credit files that we're seeing. I kind of want to go back to that because we've for so long relied on a credit report as like the holy grail of tenant screening. And I hate to say it, but unfortunately, it is really no longer that anymore. I think maybe with rent reporting, it might start to be. There's been a slow degrading of the credit files for years now to help tenants boost their credit scores. So in 2017, we saw the removal of tax liens, civil judgments, so including evictions, from credit reports. Now, if someone has an eviction, the only way you would know about it would be through like a civil court record search, but it wouldn't appear on the credit report itself. The only way it could, in a sort of, I guess, roundabout way, is if they did the debt reporting to put it as a collection on their credit report, but it doesn't automatically happen anymore. If someone gets evicted and no one reports it to the credit bureaus, then no one knows about it and their credit score isn't affected. They could owe money to the IRS and it doesn't affect their credit score either. It was really interesting to see during COVID, people's credit scores actually went up because there were so many loan deferrals and people were spending less money. So the debt ratio was lower, but it really wasn't an accurate reflection of what people were actually going through during that time. And so I think with rent reporting, it should help at least to have something on there that is going to show that they've been paying rent on time. But we also have to be just as proactive in reporting the debt as well. And that's going to take a little bit of effort. and sometimes cost on the landlord's part, but it does help really create that more fair credit file that you might be looking at when you're screening a tenant and see that they have a great score, only to find out that they might have been evicted or maybe have very low income and high debt. And that's not really on the credit report. So do your homework outside of just a credit report. And I mean, definitely with tenant screening, I would say it's a lot more than just the credit score. And I do think this rent reporting law will have an effect on renter scores in general. I guess the intention is to raise the scores, right? But I do think that if we also equally go out of our way to report the debts, then there should be some balance there as well.
Are you
I
finding
think
your
So
members are,
yeah.
oh, I was just going to say, are you
sorry, this
finding
is
your
a hot
members,
topic.
are you finding your members are shifting to other technologies? I mean, the old adage is you
Mhm.
called references, right? And then you pulled a credit report and you mentioned a couple other things. So what are you advising your members to do, or things that they're have been successful at, regardless of their
Mhm.
size, to actually find those great applicants and place them in their properties?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's other things you can do, right? So obviously background credit check, but yes, call the landlord references, call the employers, ask for the paycheck subs, ask for bank statements, ask for W-2s. You're just going to ask for more things. However, now AI has entered the picture, making it a lot easier for tenants to fraudulently create these documents or mess with them. So there are services out there that are starting to crop up that help to identify some of this AI tampering with documents. So that's one method that might help. Also, just asking for more information and verifying it on your own. It does take more legwork. I know at AAOA, we do the tenant screening portion, but we also can do the calls for the landlord verification and employer verification. And we really call them as much as we need to get a hold of them and ask them a list of comprehensive questions. Now, they may not answer all the questions, but it doesn't hurt to ask. And having that reference is actually more powerful now than it used to be. I think smart landlords are no longer skipping steps and they're spending the time because they understand that the credit report alone and even criminal and eviction records are becoming more and more limited due to new laws or even just the way that it's reported now. So you really have to do a little bit more work. And again, it's another layer of challenge, I think, especially for smaller housing providers, especially because that's who's usually targeted by these scams. It's a lot easier to go after a smaller landlord who doesn't do a background check or a thorough investigation. So, consider yourself a business, regardless of how many units you have, and you'll be okay. But it's definitely going to take a bit of work. And I know there's a couple other topics we probably want to touch on. I don't know if y'all have any, Rick or Grant, any comments on what I just said before we move on to the next topic.
I will say most of the time when I talk to people who have difficult tenants, it's oftentimes either because they didn't do enough vetting or they made an
Mhm.
exception. And it's usually
Yes.
the exception, right? Because the tenant came in, oh, my credit's bad. Why? Oh, because of A, B, and C. Like they're telling a story and then it pulls on someone's heartstrings, whatever. That, and of course, every case is different, but the majority of the time when I talk to people, it's because they made an exception on their tenant screening.
1,000%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Rick, I wanted to ask you as well about the LA fires. So I know that that was obviously an example of a really recent real estate crisis that we all went through. And I wanted to get your take on the lasting impacts of that and what you're seeing on your end, just locally.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to look at this. Of course, it was a very devastating event. So there's going to be two camps. We're already seeing lots being sold, right? So Pacific Palisades and in Altadena, the two major areas. We're seeing so far there's been about a couple hundred lots that have either sold or on the market. So some of these people are just like, look, I'm done. And they're renting for now. Some of them actually may have already bought. They're typically staying in LA or they're heading south, is really what we've been seeing in terms of movement where they're going. Because what a lot of people don't realize is, and I think Alexandra, you guys are hosting a webinar tomorrow on insurance.
Yes, we
So it
are.
might be kind of important. Most people are actually underinsured, right? So they actually don't have they find because no one thinks that their home is going to be burnt down to the ground. So some of these people like, well, I don't have the money to cover the difference because the cost of construction is so much higher. So we are seeing some people rebuilding. Everything's still kind of in plan check. Plans are slowly being submitted. When what a lot of people don't may also not know when it comes to project management, because that was actually one of my first gigs, moving down to LA. One of the biggest delays is making decisions. And so for a lot of these people who have never done a construction job before, they're like, and it's always so emotional because they lost their home. So like I'm talking to architects who are like, yeah, I'm like inching through this with these people, constantly reviewing things. So instead of it being like, all right, we're done, submit. So we're seeing a lot of delays. They're estimating it's going to take as much as 5 years for some of these communities to be rebuilt. And I think that's going to be part of it. And I also think it's just lack of resources. And so for a lot of them right now, they are renting. Maybe it's midterm rentals, right? So they're just doing month to month until they figure out what to do. Some are long term because they know they want to come back. So,
Yeah.
but go for it.
Oh, you deal with a lot of clients, obviously investors being a component of, and then the personal side. Thinking of those investors particularly, if their rental homes burnt down, are you seeing that they're the ones that are trying to sell, that they don't want to be housing providers again, or are they keen to get that rental stock back on the market so then they can kind of take advantage of some of the price changes or things like what is that side of it looking like post fire?
That's a very good question because most of the people has been primary. My hunch is that it's going to be a mix because you could take the money from selling the lot and then just go buy another investment property and start cash flowing. And it may not be a good use of your time to rebuild. On the flip side, you might also look and say, I could rebuild and now rent it at a premium because now I have a brand new construction home. So my guess is it's probably 50-50. That's a really good question. Just because they don't necessarily advertise who owns the lots. So, but yeah, so it's probably somewhere in that realm. When I've talked to
Are you
insurance
seeing
agents in general, they say that most of their clients, if there's a total loss, they end up just picking up their cash, just taking the cash, the settlement, and then moving on, and probably just selling the lot.
Interesting. I was in Houston during Hurricane Harvey, and one thing that happened is you'd have investors that came in and just bought up entire neighborhoods
Yeah.
because they had the capital, they had the project managers. Like that you would see these places where like one day there was nothing, and then the next day 10 houses were being torn down, and you saw a bunch of those individual investors. Some of them were of course personal properties that they moved on, and the bigger pockets came in to take over that rental stock, the developers, that sort of thing. Are you seeing, sounds like you're seeing some of that, but maybe not at the same scale.
Yeah, I will say there's a lot of like chatter between realtors. People like, I'm looking for land, I'm looking for land, I'm looking
Mm,
for land. They do believe in these neighborhoods. I mean, look
yeah,
at the Woolsey fire in 2018, which was for Malibu. That was 2018. Then here comes 2020, and Malibu was one of the hottest zip codes for LA County, right? Like it didn't prevent people because you have Pacific Palisades, which is very close to like Santa Monica. So it's like you get that ocean breeze. You have what's called the Village, which is a major outdoor like shopping experience. He actually owns a bunch of them in LA. So it's like it was very family oriented out there. So, there's a lot of people that I've spoken to are like, no, I'm moving back. I miss my friends, all that. I think part of the problem and part of the conversation is why would I rebuild if there's a chance it can catch on fire again and have to be displaced again? So that's where they're talking about bringing the power lines underground. Building codes change, which is going to be probably one of the biggest challenges because how big of a house you can build may be different than what the original house that was there. So someone may have had a 5,000 square foot house, but now it might have to be a 4,000 square foot house. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out of like, no city, give me an exception, which maybe they will, maybe they won't. There's a lot of conversations happening around that.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah, my hunch is that we're probably going to see more by next year, right? Because by then we'll see what kind of plans are being submitted, who's submitting them, that sort of deal. Because it's always hard to tell in the MLS those properties that are being sold versus what's being traded off market. because in that world, there's people who know developers. There are a lot of new construction out there. And then Altadena is interesting because a lot of those homes are character homes built in the early 20s. And it's really expensive to build character homes. And a lot of those people that I've spoken with, just in that general area, a lot of those owners basically they inherited those homes, second, third generation homeowners. So the home may have been worth 1.5 million, but they personally would never been able to afford that. So that's why I think some of them are selling the lots, just because they don't have the finances to rebuild, which is unfortunate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's always a
So,
risk, isn't there, in any
I
kind
know.
of housing, right?
Yeah. So like, Alexandra, how are your members handling the increased risk with like all of this kind of stuff? Whether it's not necessarily just fires, but just even with the credit reporting and things like that.
Sure. Well, they're lawyering up, some of them. I think that's
Right.
always I don't know how many times I say that during my webinars and like, but talk to your attorney. It really is, I think, becoming more of a go-to. There are some lower cost ways of going about that. Like we have a legal chat kind of partnership that's lower cost. That's one way, just staying informed, being a part of the American Apartment Owners Association. It's free to join. That's a great way to just stay informed so you know when these things are happening, and we cover that nationally. But a lot of our members are in California, and a lot of things happen in California, so we have a lot of information there for them. And then I think really debt collection. I mean, we talked about it before, but being able to report that debt that any tenant has to the credit bureaus in a really easy, seamless way is definitely going to be one of the strategies to really reduce your risk. I mean, you're going to obviously hopefully recover that debt. And what I've heard from collection agencies, from FrontLobby, different companies that do this, is that just simply threatening the reporting of the debt can in itself cause the debt to just get paid right away. If you have a lease with no teeth and you're not enforcing it, then you're not really getting what you can out of the lease agreement. Don't just give up. I think that's definitely something I'm seeing kind of happen, I think, and unfortunate, but it doesn't have to be that way. I also think insurance, not just insurance on the property, but renter's insurance. That's another big one that I see a ton of landlords just miss, and they don't require their tenants to get it. And you can absolutely make it a requirement of your lease agreement, and you definitely should. And it's not just a benefit to renters, it's a benefit to you as well, because if the renter has a slip and fall, or they have a dog bite, or if there is a flood, a robbery, whatever it is, the renter's insurance is going to cover those losses first. And then if there's anything left over, they might come to you, but you don't want to be the first source for that loss, right? That's going to help put a barrier between you and any losses the renter incurs, anything accidental. And then for things that are maybe a little more the tenant's fault, so if they don't pay rent or if they damage the property, we also have things like lease guarantee or the guarantors. There's a couple companies that do it. With the American Apartment Owners Association, if you're screening tenants with us, you will automatically get a lease guarantee offer for that tenant. So if you purchase the lease guarantee or the tenant purchases it, then if something goes wrong, the lease guarantee can cover you up to $10,000. So that would be for lost rent. It could be for damages, really any reason that you might take a tenant to court for, that's what you're going to get paid out. And then the price will vary depending on the tenant's credit, of course, but in some cases, it can really be the peace of mind that someone needs to rent to someone, right? It's okay, I got the security deposit. And if you're in California, it's only 1 month now, so it's not very much. You might want to also get that lease guarantee, require the renter's insurance, set up the rent reporting, whether it's required by law or not, for you to do it, and also let them know, hey, we're also going to be reporting your debt if you don't pay rent. And go to our webinar tomorrow to find out more about getting good insurance on your property so that you don't have to deal with that too. I mean, there's just so many layers of it, but The good thing is that there are more tools now than ever to address these risks, and they are now more available to smaller landlords. So you don't have to be a big corporation to do all these things anymore. And in fact, like I was saying earlier, you really need to treat it like a business. And that's where you're going to find, man, thank God I had that insurance, thank goodness I set up rent reporting and debt reporting, and I can actually use that tool to make my rentals less stressful and more profitable. So all of those things, I mean, I would say definitely worth it to look into and set up. And that's just going to give you peace of mind ultimately. So I think really what we teased at in the title of this webinar, right, is that this could be nationwide, right? I see this all the time because I'm looking at this nationally, right? I'm curating our newsletters. I'm curating the rent magazine that our members get. I see the writing on the wall whenever it's California, whenever it's that California doing something, it's like all the other states kind of come soon after. And so, closing question for everyone, for Grant and Rick. What do you think about this becoming a nationwide law? Do you think that's possible?
Grant, you go first.
Oh man,
Like how I
I was
threw
gonna
you
have
under
Alexandra
there.
go first. She posed the question, but all right. I kind of hope we disagree. My opinion is no. I don't think this will ever be a federally mandated law. What I see is that California is leading the way. You're going to have some fast follows. Colorado, New York. There's one in Missouri that's proposed that would go into effect on early 2026, which is pretty much a mirror image of this. You've also seen HUD that's come out recently and will look at rental data if it helps an application for a mortgage. You've seen Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac push initiatives around using positive rental payments and having those pushed towards the credit bureaus. So I think that'll continue. You'll have a continued awareness around rental data and its ability to impact credit. I think a vast majority of the noise that will come from the governments or any sort of legislation will be focused on positive only because there's a greater tendency to push the tenants agenda rather than kind of some of the protections or things around housing providers. Why I don't think it'll be ever mandated at a federal level is one, it's too complicated. Like there is privacy concerns. You need technology partners involved. You need the credit bureaus involved. There's specific legislation that specifically deals with rent reporting, which companies like ours have to be absolute masters in to build platforms in order to accommodate this. And you're still then going to have to mandate it towards smaller independents or those sorts of things. So my short answer is no. At scale, I don't think this will apply to everybody. But what I do think is that housing providers will continue to have legislation like this that makes it more difficult. You'll have certain segments, whether that's statewide or specific markets like affordable housing, that'll have to offer these sorts of programs. But you'll just see it becoming more and more forefront in the conversation until eventually, a goal of a company like ours is that in 20 or 30 years, rental data existing on credit files is just as synonymous as today seeing your Visa card or a mortgage on a credit file, and that it would have full payments. Anyways, that's my thought. Rick, what do you think?
I think it's a hard maybe. So in 2023, the Biden administration did come out with the Renters Bill of Rights, right? So that was a conversation. So I think it's going to depend on who's in office and what agenda they want to push. So in that respect, it's like, okay, maybe. If we're expecting every state to do it voluntarily, probably not. I did reach out to my property managers in the properties that I own in other states, and for them, they tend to be in states that are more housing provider friendly anyways. So they're like, well, if they stop making payments, they're out in like less than 90 days. They're out in a few weeks. Like it's not, and those tenants understand that. So oftentimes, if a tenant stops paying rent, they often leave on their own anyways, right? Because they know that they don't really have the same, I guess, protections, I guess you want to call it, as they might in like California. So I think in those states, they're going to be like, I don't think we really need it. And therefore they won't implement it. I think it's going to have to come from higher up to do something to really mandate and push it to be nationwide. Alexandra, what do you think?
I'm gonna take a
Maybe he's
yes
no.
here. I'm gonna take a yes. I do think it's possible that it could be federally required. And I think partly, as you mentioned, the Renters' Bill of Rights sort of hinted at that. I do think it's dependent on the administration, as you mentioned. But what we've seen, at least, is this really concerted effort to ensure that tenants are getting the benefits that they quote unquote deserve from paying their rent on time, as well as ultimate transparency. Those are definitely the two themes that came up the most in the Renters' Bill of Rights discussion. Marcia Fudge, she had put out, former Secretary of HUD had put out also a request for governors to really take those two topics really to heart. And I think they're trying to push it at a state level because they hadn't yet been able to do it at a federal level. But I think when given the opportunity, that I could definitely see this being a part of the Renters' Bill of Rights, and them feeling like they really should get credit, no pun intended, for actually paying rent on time. And it really is, I think, interesting to see how this has just been evolving over the years. We're seeing limitations on negative data and more emphasis on positive data. So my hope is that we can find a happy balance of both positive and negative. But I could see it happening in the far future under a Democratic president, especially if we have a lot of, I guess, recessionary issues. Who knows what will happen in the economy, but that could definitely put things back into the consumer's court to really get, I think, more from the legal system and from federal laws that'll be passed. So we'll see what happens. But interesting that we all both have a little bit of a different opinion on it. But I think we can all agree that California won't be the only state.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, they
Yeah.
will not be the only one.
Yeah.
No.
I was actually surprised that there's been nothing from New York so far. Like that
Yes,
surprised me so
surprising.
far.
That was
as
gonna be
far
my
as-
next question.
Yeah.
You know, they've been like, I think, just historically a little behind on the tenant screening stuff, though. Even with like the credit reports and the data, they're a little behind with, I think, that aspect of the law for some reason. At least that's what I've noticed from tenant screening. But they're probably going to do it too. I mean, it's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think it's
Okay.
because
Well,
in New York they
okay.
have tenants stay longer? Like that's always like the
Um,
stereotype with New York. It's like you have
I
people who live in
think,
their apartments for like 100 years. Like,
yes, I think that's part of it. And I also think there's like an old school kind of property management system in place
got it.
there that's very much, I mean, look at the broker fees. I mean, that just changed. That was just a law that got passed where, we've had application fee limits for years in California that were pretty
Mhm.
strict. And in looking in New York, the broker fees that renters were paying were insane. I mean, hundreds of dollars to brokers. And so it wasn't necessarily an application fee, it was a broker fee, but it still was part of the application process. And I was surprised that it took them so long to limit that. And then they went down to $20. That's it. That's all you can charge now in New York for everything. The tenant screening report, the application process, whatever administration fees, that's $20. That's the cap, and it applies to every rental housing provider. And I was so surprised. I mean, it is the most aggressive one in the US now, but it took them the longest to implement it. So I don't know. They're an interesting state. They're definitely progressive, but like not at the same time. Also like a little bit traditional, and they don't really change their practices as often in tenant screening, which is interesting. Belinda says that's the same thing happening in Illinois. Illinois is another one where I feel like I'm always seeing these new sort of bills coming up where they're trying to pass rent reporting. It looks like HB 3564. Illinois also was one of the first to pass requiring security deposit alternatives. So like lease guarantee that I talked about earlier, but requiring the tenants to have that option instead of paying a full security deposit, just paying for the insurance, so that it's less cost up front. Plus, like I could think of like a dozen other laws that Illinois kind of started, or maybe was one of the first on. So there's definitely some states that like to do these things a little more than others.
Yeah, I hear from your point, and I think it's a valid one. You're seeing a shift in the housing industry where less people are able to buy a home, even though they may not want to, or they're transparent. Like I've moved around a ton. And so at times I've owned a home and at times I've rented, and it doesn't really matter on finances. It's just based on how people move around. And as society kind of deals with that, I do think there's going to be more initiatives like the ones you mentioned in Illinois, like this rent reporting, that try and provide additional financial benefits to those individuals that are renting, knowing that becomes a larger and larger percentage of society. And so, I think we're all agreeing like initiatives like this aren't going away. The barriers of providing housing are only going to go up. What that looks like
Right.
from a mandate or specific legislation, I think will vary state by state and will evolve over time. But I do agree there's going to be a huge concerted push to provide as many benefits to renters in the future as possible. Just that is going to be where the mandates come.
And this is just my personal opinion, not anyone else's, but a lot of this also stems to votes, right? So if there's more tenants, like in LA, it's majority tenants. So if you're a government official, you're gonna be like, well, I need to keep my job. So like there's always that aspect. So whether that's true or not, that's for up to them to say. But so yeah, to your point, maybe in some of these states where it's more owner occupied, then it may not be, they may be behind. But as they start seeing a shift where there might become more and more tenants, then these laws might start kicking in.
Yeah. But I mean, to go back to Alexandra's initial question, like something like the rent reporting bill is widely complex because you have the FCRA that talks specifically around reporting rental data and deals with how data furnishers or creditors have to deal with that information. And now you start having housing law that talks specifically around it. And it's like it's if you get too complicated, one doesn't have jurisdiction over the other, right? So you have to have kind of at the federal level someone that would for a full mandate to say, no, we're going to say this, and you either have to abide by legislation, or in my opinion, a terrible situation if you'd say like, oh, it's going to be positive only and you can't report debts, which would just circumvent the whole point of it. But anyways, I think we're getting a bit off topic. Sorry about that. But it's just
That's
kind
for
of
the next
interesting.
webinar.
Yeah, next webinar. But interesting as you look at the complexities around some of these initiatives. It's I think the more complicated they are, the harder it will be to kind of mandate them to everybody in the future. But the push towards it will continue.
Absolutely. And I think maybe we could take some questions here to finish this off.
Sure.
Lots of questions on the process of reporting rents, which I think is going to kind of fall to you, Grant. Question on how to report rents, and also as far as like the FrontLobby system, right? What does the tenant pay as well in that process, and do you need to get the tenant's permission to do it? So those are the questions I'm seeing sort of over and over here. So maybe you can give us, just to go back on that and set the tone here for like what FrontLobby does and answer some of those questions, and then we'll take a couple others on some other topics.
Sure. So I'll open to say, if you want to talk about your specific portfolio requirements, probably best to reach out to us. We'll get on a call with you, walk through your situation, because I won't be able to answer every question on that here. Now, what I'll say is, like FrontLobby offers the ability for housing providers. You can sign up for a membership and report on-time payments as well as your tenants' debts. And that's available for every state, every province in Canada that you can report. You would have to verify your role as a housing provider, and then the tenants get a free login that they can provide consent. And if you are already paying for reporting, the tenant doesn't have to pay. All they have to do is provide consent. Now, if you're in California specifically, and you're just trying to abide by this new legislation, we have a tenant notice that complies with, similar to the one that Rick alluded to earlier. You can send it out to all of your tenants. All they have to do is sign up on the platform. They can provide consent, and then they can pay through the platform as well. And so if you want to report full file, we have a landlord paid option for that. If you are only interested in the tenants, we have an option where you can basically send out the notifications. They'll sign up, they'll do all the grunt work. You're still compliant, but of course, then the burden of payment happens to fall on them. So that's usually on the smaller side. If you get larger, there's different ways you can do it. But to keep it simple, that is essentially how it works. And just
Yeah.
as a reminder, you mentioned about consent. Consent's never required when you report a debt. So our platform has built-in protections around consent for positive reporting. We have specific opt-out components in California that exist. So we have built the platform so that if a tenant wants to participate, they can do so within the platform. They verify their ID just to ensure that additional level of security to ensure that it's going to the right credit file. And that exists. When a debt is being reported, you don't need consent, and you also don't need a judgment when you're reporting unpaid rent and utilities according to that lease. So we talked a lot about kind of going through the local tribunals and getting judgments, or if you have damages or lease breakage. If you're looking for those components, you would need a judgment, but to report unpaid rent and utilities according to the lease, consent isn't required and a judgment isn't required.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. That helps a lot. Those are definitely some of the common questions that we get as well. So also too, you mentioned the fee to the tenant. So how much is the fee? Because I know the max in California is $10, but what does FrontLobby charge the tenant if they're
It's
paying?
it's $4 if the
Okay.
tenant is signing up and doing it on their own. Yeah. And if the landlord's kind of paying for it and wants to pass off some of the costs, it can be as low as $1 at least.
Awesome. There's also a question in here for Rick. What is Rick's Facebook group? Are we able to join? I want to join too. I just have to get my
Yes.
Facebook password resolved. I'm having issues with Facebook, guys. I want to be a part of it too. How do they join your Facebook group? How can we get them in touch with you?
Yeah. So they can actually just go on Facebook. It's Los Angeles / SoCal Landlords, right
Okay.
before the name change. So you just answer a few questions if you want, put in there that you were part of the webinar, and I will get you in. And
Okay,
then I try to
great.
do a newsletter once a week where we have little tidbits, some facts you should be aware of, what's going on in the news, things like that. I try to get that out weekly.
You also have a podcast.
Wonderful.
I do. Yeah, the Key to the City of
Yes.
Angels. Grant, you're on it. Alexandra, we got to book you.
I would love
And
to be on it.
yeah, it's been a lot of fun. We launched it back in February. So I talked to people locally as well as nationally about just different topics related to real estate. And then either they bring it to LA focus or I try to bring it to LA focus because there's a lot happening across the country. But what happens in LA is different than what happens up north and all that. It's been a lot of fun. And I encourage everyone to listen and provide any and all feedback. I always appreciate it.
Great, great, awesome. Okay, so a couple other things. Marcia asking, does the California law require specific timelines on when the landlord should report the payment and the non-payment? Is it 5 days after the first month? How does that work with the law, but also with FrontLobby?
Yeah. So there's two components to that. With a system like ours, we assume that rental payments are made each month. So you basically are building a lease ledger is what it looks like. So you'd see each month that Alexandra paid, Alexandra paid, Alexandra paid. And then what we see as best practices is usually give them a couple days, wait for checks to clear or the Zelle payment to come through, whatever that is. And then you'd update the balance in the platform. Throughout that calendar month, we're assuming that rent is due on the first of the month, you'd update it to accurately reflect the total outstanding debt. If it's paid, then it's a $0 balance at the end of the month and there's no debt that gets reported to the credit bureaus. But for credit bureaus to accept debt, it must be outstanding for at least 30 days. So meaning if your tenant pays on the 15th of the month, that debt won't ever hit their credit file. You can record it in FrontLobby as being paid late, but debt won't go. So it has to be outstanding still as debt at the end of the calendar month, and then it's reported to the credit bureaus as a debt.
Right. And that does give some flexibility to the tenant still. So, that helps.
It puts pressure to negotiate.
Yeah, it gives some time to, get things moving. Deanne is asking something that I could probably answer here, which is, has anyone been using rent guarantee or the lease guarantee insurance and had to make a claim? I would think they would make it difficult for you. So I can't speak to all rent guarantees, but lease guarantee, which is the one we're partnered with, as far as making a claim, we get claims all the time, unfortunately, but it does help in some sense that you have the lease guarantee. So we try to mediate a bit before it gets to that point. But it does happen. And for the lease guarantee, it's pretty cut and dry. You just need to have a court judgment. So the payout is based on the court judgment. Other companies that do this kind of thing, they might have something a little more subjective with photos, or you know, someone that comes in and does like an adjuster kind of situation. So I'm not sure, I can't speak to other companies, but it's pretty straightforward with the lease guarantee. You just have to submit the judgment, and then within 30 days it gets paid up to whatever's like the max of the policy. So definitely we see claims and they do get resolved in a pretty straightforward way. Also too, Carmen is asking about the form that is needed for the rent reporting. So they have the California Apartment Association forms. Great, you could use that. I know, Rick, you shared the the California Association of Realtors form, correct?
Right.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Also works.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
It's
Front
also
Lobby has a form.
yeah,
we all have forms. That's just what
We all
this
have
is. It's more
forms. They all
paperwork.
yeah, more paperwork. I mean, there's the specific forms. We'll drop a link in the chat as well that goes. We've written up a page which outlines kind of a quick overview of the legislation, whether or not it applies to you, gives you our form, which you don't have to use, right? Is the benefits are our forms. They can link back to the site. You can use the one that Rick provided. You know, it just depends on what provider you're utilizing to offer rent reporting. So each form that applies by the legislation should be very similar in how it operates, but just reach out to any of us essentially for the information.
Great. Yeah, Marcia was saying, can a lease have an opt-in for acceptance of rent reporting? So this would be the opt-in, right? You'd provide the form, they're opting in there, but then also when you sign up with FrontLobby is going to send something to the tenant just to get them to click and approve as well. So you're going to get that double opt-in, which is nice. Okay.
Yeah, we try and be digital first, of course. We understand, like, you know, I was talking to a housing provider last week where they just wanted everything sent out by mail. They don't have emails for everyone. Like, there's ways around certain things, but we assume that most people have an email address and would prefer to engage digitally. So that's where the platform is built around.
Well, we still fax our clients a few things. Our favorite clients from like 20 years ago, they get faxes from us, which is crazy to me, but that's still a thing in some property management companies. Clem was asking here, can a tenant opt out anytime from rent reporting, especially if they plan not to pay rent?
Well, yes and no. So yes, they can opt out of their positive payments being reported. So in the legislation, if you read through it, the tenant can choose to have their positive payments reported, or they can choose not to have their positive payments reported. And if they opt out, they can't re-opt in for 6 months, which is really just providing data continuity to the credit bureaus. However, if they're choosing not to pay rent, as your scenario says, you can never opt out to having a debt reported. Consent isn't required, which means you can't opt out of having that debt go. So in that situation, if the individual chooses not to have their positive payments being reported and they're potentially looking to not pay rent, it's essentially a detriment to them because they'll be missing out on having those positive payments on their credit file. And then what's going to happen is immediately you'll just have that debt that will exist and we'll have a significant impact.
So it's important to clarify that to the prospective tenant. As you mentioned earlier, Grant, it's like, look, it does work both ways.
Right.
Because one way was, you've always been able to report negative debt.
For sure. And I appreciate there's a bunch of questions around notifications, lease clauses. I mean, there's the California specific notification, and then there's the general lease clauses that the three of us have talked about. And the whole point of that is you have a positive and proactive conversation. I mean, even platforms like ours, we send late payment notices out. We use rent reminders. You may already be doing this. And the whole point is that if I'm going to be late on my rent, Alexandra wants me to call her and say, hey, cash will come in on Friday. I'm going to be a few days late. And, it sparks that conversation, which most of us that have been housing providers, you've been in that situation. And what do you want? Open communication. You're willing to work with the individual because that's way better than someone just kind of cowering back and not paying, right? And so hopefully by having the reporting and having some of these communication tools that you're utilizing with some of the things Alexandra mentioned as well, like that kind of helps spur an openness between you and your tenant and a historical kind of abrasive relationship at times.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there were a couple questions about who this law applies to. I think you briefly covered that, Grant, that it's 15 units or more, or they have to be, what was the other second part
Yeah.
to that.
So if you have a building that is over 15 units, this applies to you. If you have your buildings are under 15 units and you have multiple of them, you only have to report if you're a corporation, a REIT, or an LLC where at least one member is a corporation.
Beautifully said. Okay, that answer Amir's question, John's question. John was asking, is this for large complexes only? So anyone can use rent reporting at any amount of units. That's the beauty of FrontLobby. But the law itself doesn't require you to do it if you're just have like one rental, right? Still benefit, as we've been talking about. Also, Lynn Scott here was saying, my understanding is that judgments are not picked up by the credit agencies. Correct. This is not something that just happens automatically. You don't need to have a judgment for it to be reported, but you have to actively report it. So can you talk a little bit more on that, Grant, is the reporting side of the judgment? How does that work with FrontLobby? Is it the same if there's a judgment or not?
Yeah, I'll use an example. So you can report rental data from the past 7 years. So in the US, statutes of limitations is 7 years. So if I move out of the rental property and I have $1,500 in unpaid rent and I damaged your property, you can start reporting that $1,500 today. It's outlined in the lease, it's unpaid rent, consent's not required, so you start reporting that today. You then go through the local tribunals, the channels, you obtain a judgment that says I now owe additional $5,000 in damages. You simply update the balance to reflect what's in that judgment. So it could be $6,500 total, which is the unpaid rent, as well as the damages I provided. And then it updates the balance on the credit bureaus to accurately reflect that dollar value. So that's specific to the rent reporting as it exists on the credit bureaus. But Alexandra, you were talking about some screening options earlier, which I think is important to highlight, where they can actually look for those judgments as well. Did you want to touch on that here too?
Yes, absolutely. So we recently added this to our premium tenant screening package, which is really the most comprehensive one you can get. It has all of the things you would want from like a credit and background check perspective, but now we've added the tax liens and civil judgments to it. So civil judgments meaning any kind of judgment. So it doesn't even need to be an eviction. It can be if the property management company sued the tenant because the damages exceeded the security deposit. That might be on their, not on their credit report, but it might be in the court record, right? So we're able to catch some of these judgments that are occurring and are not appearing on a credit report. Because again, there's just so many landlords and property management companies that don't take that extra step to report judgments. I mean, I think all of us on this call should be doing that, but unfortunately, not everyone does. And so having this separate search where we're searching for court records really helps to pick that up. And it's also lawsuits of any kind too. So literally any reason your tenant could have been sued, judgment or not, like monetary judgment or not, if they were at fault, it would appear in that report. Or you can add it on, it's just $5. So I think for $5, it's definitely worth it to add on to any credit report, just because that's like a pretty big piece of information that has been missing from credit reports for so many years now. And I think not a lot of tenant screening companies have offered it. And so I definitely see that as one piece of missing info that could help you make a decision. And then it also covers bankruptcies, which should be on a credit report, but it's going to give you a little bit more detail on that. It's basically public records, right? That's what we're looking at, and could really make a big difference. So thanks for bringing that up, Grant. Also, too, we have a couple of questions on how to remove negative marks. So that's interesting. So now the tenant has paid you back. Can you take it down?
No. You don't delete the information. It just gets updated. So essentially what happens is if there's been a debt that's been reported for a while, it kind of shows the history of the debt. I'm assuming everyone on this call has seen a credit file, so you'll understand, you see kind of that historical debt. Once the tenant pays that off, then it shows a $0 balance and in good standing. So now if that's a tenant that moved out, let's say you had a judgment, you're no longer going to be actively reporting. So the terminology around that is it's closed in good standing, which would look very similar to a credit card that you had maybe when you were, in college or something. It's like, okay, I haven't had that credit card for 5 years or whatever it is, and it shows that you paid it off in full. There's no still outstanding debt. And essentially that's what the trade line would look like. It closed in good standing. So when a debt exists, it just gets updated. You don't want to be removing information. You can't do that unless there's a reason to, because it's kind of falsifying the information, right? The credit bureaus don't want you to report something that you get the benefit and then it gets removed. And so there's specific requirements that information doesn't get deleted. So don't negotiate with your tenant to say, hey, Rick, if you pay me your debt, I'll remove this. No, it should be, you should pay this off. So then that way, it gets zeroed out. So the impact is minimized. Or if you're a current tenant, if you zero this out, then you can actually continue to use your on-time payments to build back that credit, right? And so that negotiation or conversation should happen that way versus trying to promise to say that if you pay, I'll just eliminate it. That shouldn't be a part of the conversation.
Well said. Well said. Lucy was asking here, I don't fit the criteria that requires participation in California. So can I choose to report without the tenant's permission or even notifying the tenant?
For debts, yes. For positive reporting, consent still required. So you'd still, yeah.
Interesting.
But in that situation, if it doesn't apply, I'd say use lease clauses that we have, and then you can still use the platform. It'll do all the notifications and those sorts of things. If the tenant wants to participate on the positive, great. But then you also have the protection around being able to report the debt if one does come up.
Well, Belinda has an interesting question. I'm curious to have your take on this, Grant. So in Illinois, they're trying to pass a bill that will stop us from running credit reports on our new tenants. No application fees and no move-in fees, only security deposits. With this happening, where is the benefit in reporting?
Well, I would say that you got to think about it from you operating that house. So if an individual is in your property, their credit file is visible to all future creditors, not just their next landlord. And so providing leverage to help make sure you get paid from your current tenants, being able to report that data still provides a lot of value to you because you want to make sure you get paid. It's not going to provide any value to the next landlord, unfortunately, that goes to see it, but that'll be visible when they go to get a credit card or when they go to get an auto loan or those sorts of things. So it still keeps you top of mind when the tenant is looking at what bills to pay that next month. It's kind of crappy to think of that information just being hidden from, I hadn't actually heard that. So thank you for sharing that. I'll definitely go and look into that a bit more, but think about it from you as the housing provider. It's going to provide a benefit for you as the person that's trying to cash flow that building. So that's what I'd say.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen it in Section 8 public housing in California now. That's a new law where they don't have to show you a credit report. If they don't want to, they can have an alternative form of financial verification. And
you beat me to it.
No, did I? Tell me more. Tell me more.
No. What you just said was what I'm aware of. Yeah, because the argument is like, well, if the government is subsidizing the majority of it, does it really matter? But we all know it does matter because they're still paying something.
A lot of times, yeah. Most of the time they're paying some percentage, right? Okay, well, I know we are 15 minutes over time, which is amazing. I didn't even realize so much time went by. There are still some questions in the chat, and the Q&A. So I think if you all are okay with this, we might close out here. The information for all of us is on here. Someone was asking about the webinar I'm doing tomorrow with our insurance partner. So if you want to join that, send me an email or go to our website under education. You should be able to find our webinars. Or if you send me an email, I'll send you the link for that. And then we have Grant's information there. So anything related to the rent reporting questions, you can send Grant's way. I think what Grant said was important too is, if you have like a specific kind of setup or situation, it's probably just a good idea to talk to someone at FrontLobby to get it set up the way that works best for you. And then we have Rick with his podcast. The name of the podcast is there. And then also Rick's email and website. and then let him know if you want to join his Facebook group as well. And we're also, of course, recording this. So we're going to have FrontLobby send out the recording tomorrow and a few free giveaways. I believe some of them are surprises, but it might involve some lease clauses, if I'm not mistaken. So very, very glad that I had a chance to be on this panel with both of you. This was really great. I think we covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you both.
Yeah. Yeah, it was informative even for me. So I appreciate it.
I love that. We all learned something today. All
Yeah.
right. Well, with that, I think we'll close out the webinar here unless you all have any closing remarks.
No, I
Tenant
think this
screening
is
is
great.
important.
I like that.
Right, there you go.
I like
There
that.
you
I can get behind that message. I'm also doing a tenant screening webinar in 2 weeks. If you all want to learn more about the red flags on a credit report that you can see still that haven't been removed. So we'll be having that. Send me an email. I'll send you some invites if you're interested in more webinars like that. And with that said, hope everyone has a wonderful day. We'll end it here. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.